Thank you for joining us. My name is Alud Davies. I'm the editor of Corporate Jet Investor. We are going to talk about Asia during this panel. So I'm going to start by asking David, first of all, to introduce himself.
Good afternoon. I'm David Dixon with Jetcraft, based in Hong Kong. I have been away for 3 weeks, before you ask. And I'm delighted to be here for my 10th CJI.
Jeff Lowe, I'm Managing Director of Asian Sky Group in Hong Kong.
James Bradley, partner at K&L Gates in the Singapore office.
Okay, that's great, thanks. Actually, Al, aren't you expecting somebody else? Do you know where he is? No idea at all. Okay. That's awkward, isn't it? He should have been here.
He's got lost.
He's got lost, has he? Okay, fair enough. So let's start, first of all, by asking you each just to sum up the current Asian market in one word.
Hi. Oh, what did I miss?
Hey.
Hello, Paul.
Wow, that last session was long. Hi, guys.
It's our very own Carlos Ghosn.
It's the latest trend in Asia. It's traveling private in music cases. So it's been a long flight.
So, Paul, do you want to just introduce yourself properly?
Hi, I'm Paul.
He's a lawyer. He's a lawyer.
Apparently. And I've been in that box for the past 20 minutes. Slightly longer than we bargained for, Al, but we'll talk about why in a second.
Okay, let's start with one word quickly about the current state of the Asian market from each of you.
One word.
One word.
In a pause mode.
I thought about this because you warned us beforehand, and the best thing I could come up with was mucky. That's what I could come up with.
I actually see it as an opportunity.
And Paul?
One word, charlatanism. We'll talk.
So the really interesting thing there was the three of you from Hong Kong had a slightly different view from the guy from Singapore. Paul, let's start with you at the end. What are the current issues you can see in Asia?
We'll park the issues with the various protests in Hong Kong and the current virus, which will naturally have a lag period before they take effect. The trade war has resulted in direct impact on trading activity. That said, you must keep in mind that in Asia, over the course of the past 15 years, we've experienced an unprecedented period of explosive wealth creation. So to the extent where I'm sure we'll identify activity has slowed down, you have to keep that in the context of what's gone on over the past, let's say, 10 to 12 years, 8 to 12 years.
David?
Hong Kong has obviously got its immediate problems, but regionally I think China is always the one that people ask about, and that's the turnkey. That's where it pivots essentially. In the last 12, 18 months or so, it's been a reduction of airplanes in the fleet. So that's in Jetcraft's particular role of disposing of people's airplanes. That's not a bad thing, but the problem is the airplanes not going back in. I've said many times in the past there are less aircraft in Asia than there are in the whole of California. So even if that's going backwards, the numbers in the industry are fairly small. But it's worrying. The reasons in China, it's a bit like Russia. It's a one-man state now. They're applying foreign exchange rules and regulations unlike they've never done before, and tax regulations. And that's driven out some of the airplanes. So the froth has gone.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think it's much what David and Paul said. I mean, a lot of people ask me, what impact does the tariff and everything else? I mean, directly probably nothing, but it affects sentiment and confidence, and that, when you're not sure where you're going to be the next 3-6 months, you generally don't buy something. And so I think so that's one thing, but I think as David kind of alludes to, one of the other issues you have is, the Chinese economy just hasn't been performing well recently as well. And so, again, in the US, they always say when it's a down market, the first thing that goes is your corporate jet. Well, not too surprisingly, coming out of China, you're seeing a lot of those airplanes coming out now as well. As David said, it's mostly sellers, nothing's going back in. But again, some of those airplanes are staying in Asia, I think going down into Southeast Asia. So that's always encouraging. A good majority going into the US, of course. But that's kind of the flow of things right at the moment. And again, what long-term effects the continued struggles of Hong Kong will be in the mainland regarding the coronavirus, it's far too early to tell at this point in time.
And obviously I'm the rest of Asia here. And I do see things slightly different. We do operations in Hong Kong and into the mainland, but we have seen in the last 12 months, and looking at the deals of our clients and the pipeline that they're bringing to us as a law firm, a reason to be optimistic outside of China. We are at the forefront of Southeast Asia, what's happening in Australasia, what's happening in the Indian subcontinent, and we continue seeing aircraft going into that region. We continue seeing people having an appetite to finance in those regions. So while I'm more on the optimistic side, I can understand why there's some concerns on the mainland side. But I don't think this is and we've touched on the coronavirus, but obviously, this isn't something right now at the beginning of this conversation that's worth spending a lot of time on. But in Southeast Asia, we're definitely seeing an appetite for people to look into those geographies, start financing aircraft in those jurisdictions, start to trade in those jurisdictions. So I'd say that's actually picked up in the last 24 months. So it may be and it may be a direct reaction to what's happening in China, but I'd say we're seeing more business in that region.
Okay, and so we had a couple of mentions of the coronavirus just then. I was going back through the archives and read an article in the New York Times, I think it was, from back in 2003 when SARS was going on. And one Hong Kong operator said that the amount of phone calls they were getting for charter requests literally quadrupled overnight because people didn't want to travel on airlines and wanted to fly by themselves. And also, a lot more aircraft were actually sold in the region at the time, weren't they? David, I think you in particular sold more aircraft.
There were one or two situations where individuals who were on the fence whether they wanted to own an airplane at all didn't decide as a result of SARS. And certainly charter went way up, and it's done that now already. The difference now is that there are people not being able to move in anything between A and B in certain places. That's different to SARS. So the treatment of this situation is certainly more serious. The governments are far more proactive, maybe, some are, some aren't, in trying to get on top of this problem. I see this as going to escalate quite a long way. It's not going to blow over.
Anybody else, any feelings from back in 2003?
I'd say what you've got now is, well, now I've been in the region since '96, believe it or not, working in China, then through Hong Kong into Singapore. And the thing here is, and I use Singapore as an example, but Singapore was very quick to respond to this. They have decided, and there's 69 commercial flights a day to the mainland PRC, and it's not an insignificant amount of numbers, and they've immediately put in an embargo in terms of what happens to people when they arrive in Singapore. There's a 14 days quarantine. That's there. Are we seeing charter numbers go up for the charter providers that I act for? The demand has increased the last couple of weeks. I spoke to one this morning, and they said that this has increased for sure.
That's interesting. I spoke to a Hong Kong operator over the weekend as well, and they said they've definitely seen an increase in requests as well. So going further back, China's problems actually goes back further, doesn't it? So maybe we can talk about the effects of the US-China trade war and how much of an effect that had on business aviation in China. Paul, do you want to?
Yeah, I think the first comment to make is stepping back from a macro perspective. It's had a chilling effect on commerce. And in particular, there were questions. We did 650ER deliveries last year, most of them into Chinese clients. Shout out to Gulfstream. But there was some question at a certain moment in time about whether those aircraft would be impacted by any type of potential restriction placed on their importation. Luckily, that didn't come to being, but beyond that, beyond the macro and the sort of that slice of the micro, there really hasn't been anything to report from my perspective.
And David, have you seen any less activity in China?
I wouldn't put things specifically down to trade embargoes, frankly. I think there have been other issues in the region, China's internal problems, issues in terms of the economy. So no, I wouldn't say that. You sometimes get a bit of saber rattling at top end of sort of governments and things, and it isn't actually applying at the bottom end. People out on the street buying and selling, as far as I can see. Like what's going on now with the virus is going to have a bigger impact on the region, across the region. Unlike the previous times, the Chinese are big travelers now. 17, 18 years ago, they needed visas for everything. Now they don't need visas anywhere. Take that tourist away, the economy's going. So I'm more concerned about the financial impact of this than I was about a certain individual in the White House.
And so, Jeff, you're probably quite a lot closer to the data than everybody else. I think your fleet report is probably due for publication in April time, I think it is. We had a sneak peek of it the other day in the latest ASQ that's coming up. I wasn't particularly surprised by what I saw happening in China, but I was a little bit shocked. I won't give the game away, but I was a little bit shocked with the numbers in Hong Kong.
Well, yeah, if you look at, we do a market survey every 3 months, and we ask some very basic questions, and we've been asking those same basic questions for 3-4 years now. So for me, it's fascinating to see how the public perception, if you will, the mood and intention that people have, and how that relates to some of what the things we talk about as far as transactions and everything else. I mean, you can literally go back, and so we track the optimism and pessimism in the region, and we get about 500 respondents from the Asia-Pacific region, and you can literally see it climbing through the years until April 2018, which is when the tariffs first started introducing, and it just dropped off a cliff right there. And the curve really continues and maps the sort of the ins and outs that we experienced with tariffs when we thought there was going to be a deal and then there wasn't, and then they back and forth, and it literally maps it directly. And so, and again, as I said, I don't think, again, as David, I don't think it directly impacted transactions, but it certainly was another reason for people to just pause. And again, you see that in another question that we ask, what is your purchase intention? And again, it would trail that, well, my purchase intention is down now. And again, just that mood and sentiment. We all know how it affects our purchasing ideas at the time. Again, for much bigger issues that most of our clients were dealing with were more related just to good old, my business wasn't performing as well as I was hoping it was, and that was just more the Chinese economy. And so we certainly had clients that when times are good, I can justify having that aircraft on the ramp, but when they're not, things are a little bit tighter, I have to move that airplane because I can't justify it anymore. And certainly had clients as well that were, I'm in financial stress, I need to move this airplane, I'm being told I need to move this airplane by my financer. So again, that type of transaction that was occurring as well. So.
And James, in Southeast Asia, are you seeing much fallout?
In terms of Chinese numbers of travellers, yes. I mean, obviously, we're going to see a significant amount of Chinese tourists dropping off, and the flights obviously reduced to Southeast Asia. It's not just Europe and America that's reduced flight numbers. I think what we're seeing in Southeast Asia as well as a big change in the macroeconomy as well. It's probably fair to say that the manufacturing industry in Vietnam and Indonesia is growing very significantly. I'm touching on some of the questions that are in here, but those economies are changing very dramatically. The growth in Vietnam is absolutely humongous right now. We do work for airlines and for the commercial aviation space as well. And we continue looking at Vietnam and see it as a very positive story at the moment. So, I mean, I know I'm touching on that, but I see Vietnam as becoming a really strong competitor on the manufacturing side and economically with China. So if we start looking at where the engine rooms and the manufacturing rooms in Southeast Asia are developing, that would pull a lot of that into there and pull a lot of sway. And I think, the region has been dominated by conversation for the last 20 years on what's happening in the PRC. I think you're going to start seeing more powers in Southeast Asia. The growth of Australia is staggering over the last 20 years, and it seems to have gone very much under the radar.
Jeff, have we seen many business aircraft in Vietnam?
I don't know. You must be 3 or 4 maybe now. Sorry, 9? Okay, 9. All right.
I can talk to Vietnam for a second, and I agree with what James said about the state of its economy. We are now, to answer that question directly, we are now finally seeing new aircraft orders for Vietnamese companies. I know because I'm representing them. So that's been a long time coming, and I believe, as David said, at the moment it's a relatively tiny fleet. but that's set to grow, and it's sort of set to renew as well. Addressing the question and touching on something else my colleague James said about which Asian country is the most, oh sorry, I thought it said active. I'll say active and attractive. Active, any day of the week, no matter what, is always going to be China, for the same reason why if you ask the same question on a global basis, it'll always be the United States. In terms of attractive at the moment, I'm going to put myself out there a little bit, and I'm going to say that it continues to be China. I represent mostly owners. I represent owners over the past 5 years that hold $250 billion in published wealth. A lot of them are in Asia, but not all of them. I represent a household name in China who said to me something along the lines a few weeks ago that he lost $1 million yesterday, he'll lose another $1 million today, and at that rate, he expects to be broke in 3,000 days. So they've got a long staying power, and I expect that market to pick up again once the current storm is passed as well.
Yeah.
Just to add on to Paul's bit, to address that question as well, what is the most attractive place for business aviation? It depends on the perspective you're taking it from. Paul and I obviously take it from the perspective of lawyers, risk aversion, making sure our clients' rights are protected, make sure that's there. So if you break it down onto, repossessions, if you break it down onto likelihood of the aviation authority taking liens on it, how it plays out with Cape Town, those things may be something the lawyers look at it as a perspective. The macro economists may look at it as, if we go into somewhere like Vietnam or Indonesia, or where we place it, as to where that economy is going. Do we want to be in there at the beginning? Do we want to start financing? Do we want to be the brand? One of the things I look at when I'm looking at clients and where our clients are looking to finance aircraft is, where's that country going as a general trend? Now, we can all agree that Vietnam's explosion in an economic stance is quite significant. But also culturally, it's changed quite a lot. For someone that's been going there for the last 20 years, this year we're hosting the Grand Prix in Vietnam. It's going to see a significant change towards what that does, how that perception happens. And as someone that was in Singapore when the first Grand Prix happened there and saw how that affected the kind of private jets that came in, the charter companies that came into Singapore, I imagine that's going to go the same way. I know it's very much the intention of the organisers for the F1 in Hanoi, and we'll be there in April. But it is the intention to start changing the perception culturally, the perception of business, perception of wealth. There are some very, very rich individuals in these jurisdictions who are looking for these things and are talking to people about it.
Okay, so the top question is...
Again, talking attractiveness, again, for us on the stage that are in the transaction side of it. I mean, business is good in China, but it's mostly sellers, okay? But the opportunities are there, and if you're willing to look at that B China registered G550 coming out of Tianjin, there are great opportunities as well. Part of the reason why I said for how's the market at the moment is it's kind of mucky in that, yeah, they're not U.S. transactions, okay? An N-reg to an N-reg. It's a B-reg going typically to the U.S., and there are a lot of ups and downs and ins and outs, but again, generally it takes a little bit longer, and I know for the U.S. brokers that means investing more time and man hours in the transaction, but hopefully the end result allows you to have a better economic result as well, because if you're willing to stick with it, they're normally, you can get a fairly, shall we say, attractive transaction that makes it worthwhile as well. So, I mean, 2019 for us was the busiest for transactions that we've had. Yes, we may have been a little bit squeezed on, I think Steve had said earlier that he was doing less transactions but making more money. Well, we're doing more transactions and probably maybe making the same money, but it's not the way you'd like it to be, but it's a competitive market space where we are, so we're certainly getting squeezed on the cost of our services that we provide to our clients, which is one thing. But it's a great opportunity. It's very attractive in China at the moment. Lots of airplanes are moving out of that region. So.
And actually, James touched on this, and I'd be curious to get David and Jeff's views on this, and not to air dirty laundry, but I believe everyone knows that there are distressed situations in China. Any lender that tells you that they don't have borrowers in distress in the region is not telling you the truth. And so, short of full-on repossessions, which we have seen, there are a number of directed sales at the moment, which are sort of being driven by buyers that are in various stages of distress. So I'm wondering, Jeff, picking up on what you said, are you seeing a lot of your sales sort of coming out of that space, and David as well?
Yes, I mean, again, they're not, if you will, true repossessions in that the bank hasn't stepped in and taken possession of the aircraft, but certainly the transaction is at a state where certainly the finance company is dictating the transaction. I mean, they haven't taken the airplane, but the borrower is in distress, and certainly, yes, you may talk to the owner, but you also then have to talk to the finance company and make sure everything's on side. But typically what you find also, because in our space in Asia, you've got management companies and everything else, it's not just the lender who's not been paid. It's the management company that hasn't been paid too. The lawyer hasn't been paid too. No, they haven't been paying their programs. They haven't been paying this, that, and the other as well. So again, to my comment, where it being kind of a mucky business at the moment, you know, you do a closing and you've got 7, 8 people on the call, all getting dispersed out of escrow first before the owner gets what's left over. And so it takes a lot of work to get all those parties in agreement and have them understand how escrow even works. Some of them don't understand escrow. You know, they're first-time sellers. We dealt with them when they were first-time buyers, and now they're first-time sellers. I'm not sure which is worse. So there's a huge education curve when it comes to selling the airplane as well. And a lot of it, we hold their hands of both sides to try to take them through that transaction and get it across the finish line. So absolutely, some of our clients, a good share of them, are in that mode.
There are controlled sales going on, and banks driving it, as Jeff said. Not just China, it's beyond the shores of China. China's got a unique set of problems, but there are others in the region, without being too specific, that are being repossessed, or bills are not being paid, and you see the warning signs coming up. Airplanes sit outside, not being attended to. And then this snowball gathers, and corrosion and things like that all start creeping in, and we end up with I know of 2 airplanes, one of which 100% is written off, and another one that's on the verge of being written off just by neglect. Not resold, just neglect.
And so we touched on Vietnam. James, where else in Southeast Asia should we be looking at?
I think at the moment the obvious competitor in Southeast Asia, if we go there, is Indonesia. It remains a growth area. The manufacturing economy is back in Indonesia. There is greater stability politically within Indonesia right now, and that remains attractive to a lot of people. There are ways in which we structure the transactions to address this. Because of, for those that appreciate the legalese, because of the cabotage rules in Indonesia as well, the aircraft needs to be PK registered. Now, that can cause various positive and negative effects. That PK is the local registry in Indonesia, and that takes some understanding, some overcoming. We work very closely with local council there too, and I think this is the point Jeff talks about. There's a lot of education in the region that goes on that maybe when you're in Europe or you're in the United States that you don't see happening. You know, people like Paul and myself are out there explaining to either the borrower side, the lender side, the interested parties in the region, what exactly is involved in structuring these transactions. We can spend months before we're actually mandated just structuring the transactions so they work in a way that is friendly both to the consumer side and to the financiers, the insurance side, and if ultimately any risks is borne by the receivers that may be appointed. They have to be bankable transactions. Indonesia is offering an attractive market. You know, it is naturally as a geography an archipelago, which is why the cabotage is so important there, because people will be in Jakarta, Yogyakarta, and they'll go, oh, I'll just go down to Bali for the weekend. Well, great. If you're on the NREG, you can't do that. So you need to be looking at local registry. So a lot of explanations to credit teams of the financiers or the lessors are required. The local insurance, they will always have local insurance. The same applies for a lot of the regions in Southeast Asia, but making sure that the reinsurance is there. It's stuff that's probably everyday transaction common sense in Europe and North America, but takes a lot more explanation in a market where maybe English isn't the first language, or French, or one of the most common languages. You know, we've tried to address that by having a very diverse team at Kennel Gates, and that helps considerably.
Paul, are you doing much in Southeast Asia at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. To pick up on what James said, there are certainly people in the room that have been burned in Indonesia, and when you get burned in Indonesia, you get burned quite badly, and I'm not just talking about sunburn, but certainly I would say Indonesia probably has the most potential of the Southeast Asian regions. At the moment there is a lot of hesitation in the international finance community for doing Indonesian registered aircraft, but I think certainly that's something that's being people are getting over. But apart from Indonesia, in terms of countries that we're talking about, now keep in mind this is coming from a very low base. Right, so we're talking about from 0 aircraft to 5 aircraft. So Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar is worth mentioning. Thailand is also worth mentioning. But this is sort of, as David very smartly said, we're talking about less numbers of aircraft in the entire in China or in the region than you find in California. Just to pick up on something else that James said, I do transactions. I've got American owners. I've got African owners, Middle Eastern owners, Europeans. The Asian transactions, there is never an easy Asian transaction. And your role as an intermediary, as a facilitator, whether it's a broker, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's an operator or bank, is there's a lot of education that goes on. And so patience is a virtue, which is something I've come to learn in the past few years living there. But yeah, just to touch on that.
Okay, and David, from Jetcraft's point of view, are you seeing much action in Southeast Asia?
Well, if you look at my passport, I go to Jakarta a lot, and that's a good indication of where things are moving, for the reasons that have been mentioned by others. Malaysia, there's stuff going on, it's a good market. When people talk about Singapore, actually it's just an aircraft carrier. Very few people own airplanes in Singapore. You go in there for maintenance and refuel and look at your money and fly out again. So it's not a market per se, but it's a place people go for business. So I go to Singapore a lot. But quietly, Vietnam's been coming along. I mean, it just, in all fairness, Dassault, but there's the historical connection. Have got a few airplanes in there. So there's little fires all going around in the region. It's not all gloom and doom. It's, you pick up 1s and 2s in Japan. Quite happy to do that.
Jeff, you were nodding along when David mentioned Malaysia.
Yeah, I mean, there's not that many countries to choose from. So Indonesia, Malaysia, yes. I mean, some of the Chinese airplanes that we're seeing are not going to the U.S. They're going down into Southeast Asia. And it's the same as David said. A lot of them will go through Singapore just for the transaction, but they're ending up in Indonesia or Malaysia or Thailand. So, Vietnam has been very successful for Falcon. They've had a good run there. So, yeah, so I mean, it's like I said, there's only 4 real countries to choose from down there. So,
the only response I'd have to that, Jeff, is with Malaysia, the change of government has led to capital controls on the guarantees, which is effectively around $10 million on the personal guarantees and the corporate guarantees. So that's caused a bit of an issue for some people in the last year, as you can imagine. But as a jurisdiction, as a risk jurisdiction, having the common law system has always made it an attractive jurisdiction to place aircraft into.
And so one of the questions that was asked was about A-Base this year and whether we think A-Base is going to be cancelled. A-Base, whether A-Base is going to be cancelled this year.
I'm not touching that.
I put money on that it will be, because when things like the Americans have said, anyone's been to China because can't come back to the States, and A-Base is an American event. But it may change. There might be someone might invent a solution to this problem. We'll get jabbed and everyone can travel again. But I would say at the moment, because of the costs of building all your stands and all that stuff, I would say that it's just a few days away from getting the chop.
Jeff?
yeah, I see. It's, we all need significant lead times before a big show like that. And so I think time's running out for them to make a decision. I think the last I'd heard, they were going to wait and see how next week goes with Singapore and everything else. frankly, I don't see what that has to do with it. And I think much like David, I think it's just given the current environment, I don't know how they can hold it. I mean, they've talked. Other people have said, well, you think they're just going to postpone it or they're going to move it to somewhere else, and I think it'll just be, we won't see one this year. So I think, but nothing official at this point in time.
Move it down to Mar-a-Lago.
Come to Singapore.
Move it to Hong Kong.
Well, part of the problem is the schedule's so full between shows that are already there and conferences and everything else. I don't know where you'd move it to. So, and again, it's just a huge logistical challenge to change locations and go someplace else. So.
But I mean, look, changing topic, we should talk about North Asia a little bit. North Asia?
North Vietnam.
Yeah, North Vietnam. North Korea, great market. But certainly Japan, Korea, it's seen increased activity. Japan had I don't know if you guys all heard, there was a little incident in Japan recently with a certain CEO of a certain automaker. That interestingly, throughout this conference, there's been a theme of sort of public perception management, and indeed government perception management. And I think what happened with our Turkish and Lebanese friends will have an impact certainly on operators in Japan, but also potentially in the market as well. I don't know if that's a controversial statement, but you might have a view on that, David. Japan market.
As I said earlier, we pick up ones and twosies up there. I think it's a small market. It's very regulated. The airport access has all these problems that we know about and talk about endlessly, I'm afraid, and nothing happens. But a lot of Japanese airplanes are outside the country, of course. So like Nissan, for example, not anything to do with this thing, but I wish it would change the regulations, and if it was one environment that brought something like the Toyota car and mass production, why it can't embrace our business has always been a mystery to me ever since I set foot in the country. It is beyond me why they can't embrace our business across the board. It's sad, but it's not going to happen soon.
I agree with that. We do a lot of work in Japan. Our Tokyo office is very strong, and the Bengoshi always are telling me that because of the cultural face and the perception of wealth in Japan, this is one of the huge, this would need a cultural re-education to change the desire to do more business jets in Japan. I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.